started a series titled Legacy as a church a couple weeks ago, and we've been talking about the mantle of leadership and how every single person, every one of you, whether you consider yourself a leader or not, you have a sphere of influence. God has created you to have an influence, and what kind of a leader are you called to be? And so we're going through the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we're following the story of these kings that have risen up in Israel. And we started with Saul, and we talked about how he was the people's choice, and he desired power, and he wanted to hold on to his power, and his desire for power in that way was really his downfall. It is what caused the Lord to lift his hand off of Saul's kingship in his life. And so we've been going through this series and talking about what kind of leader are you? Because we have all three types that we're talking about. We have all these different types of leaders within us. We have all these things within us, but most of us lean or gravitate toward something specifically. And so we're going and we're unpacking it, and we started with Saul and we moved to David and we talked about his anointing. And it's interesting when we talk about leadership or this idea of leading people. I remember early on, I think I've shared it before, I had a boss that would have me do random things. You ever have a boss that just gives you random jobs around work? I know Noah works at Starbucks and he has to clean drains out. You guys come in there for your nice coffee drinks, but you don't realize behind the scenes there's a nasty old drain on the floor with like old spilt milk in it, and someone's got to clean that out. Anyone have a job like that ever? Zach, you're a farmer. We're not even going to go there. I'm sure there's all kinds of weird things. But if you've ever had a boss that gives you weird jobs, I had a boss like that, and he'd be like, go and change these light bulbs. There is nothing I hate more than changing fluorescent light bulbs. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Like, give me a twisty light bulb all day. I'll climb on a sketchy ladder. I'll do whatever. But I hate fluorescent light bulbs. In the stairwell back here, if any of y'all with kids ever came in there was from the time we got the church, there was a fluorescent light way high up that had like 1 million dead ladybugs in it. And finally I was like, this is gross. Someone's going to think like we're disgusting. I got to clean this out. And so this week, John was holding the big orange ladder and I'm standing on top of it, stretching out because there's no way to get to it. And I'm like, well, I'm up here. I might as well change the fluorescent light bulbs. Let me tell you, God was testing my Christianity in that moment. Because if you don't get it in right and twist it and it doesn't work, and half the time they don't work anyway, and it's just a challenge. And I had a boss that would make me do things like this. And finally it got to a point, I was in my 20s, real early on, I was a youth pastor. And finally I sat down and I'm like, why are you making me do all this stuff? Why are, like, we have someone that it's their job. Like, and my attitude, my humanity took over. Like, I'm the youth, I'm above changing light bulbs, right? Anyone ever, you don't have to raise your hands, but I know we've all been in that place. Like, I'm above cleaning the toilets. That's why you have kids, so they get older and they can clean the toilets, right? And I'm above this role. And I remember like my attitude took over, and I had a conversation with my boss, and I said, well, why do you keep asking me to do all these jobs? And I remember the conversation because it stuck with me forever. He said, I'm testing your faithfulness. And I remember, like, I had this attitude, like, I want to preach, like, you should be having me lead this or do this, and you're having me change light bulbs. And he was saying, I'm testing your faithfulness in the small things, right? You guys ever heard this before? I'm testing your faithfulness in the small things before I give you the platform of the great. And I think so often we want the promotion. We want the house, we want the car, we want the bank account, we want the big thing, but we haven't figured out to be faithful in the small. And he was saying, like, you're early on in ministry, and if you can't change a light bulb with faithfulness, if you can't be dependent on doing the little things, then you will never develop into becoming faithful in the great. And I remember being really mad out of that conversation, right? If you've ever had that conversation, you're like, well, this is still stupid. I don't want to change fluorescent light bulbs. But the interesting thing is, as I've gotten older and I've moved into a new role and I've developed, that conversation has always stayed with me. And it's actually become a part of ministry for me, is that what are we developing within the church? Even as I have, Noah is in college, and we don't call him an intern, but he's a ministry resident because it makes him sound more, better. But really, he just throws things away and moves things around and does stuff. So, pulls weeds, and actually was burning weeds in the parking lot one day with a propane tank. Dangerous stuff. I got a hold of it, and we almost lit the whole church on fire. And that's another story for another day. But I remember, as I'm in that, this idea of faithfulness keeps coming up a lot. And I think in church, in this setting, we love to talk about faithfulness, right? If you've grown up around church, you've heard the conversation a lot. And we love to talk about faithfulness, but I think the reality is in our lives, we undervalue faithfulness. It sounds really great to talk about, but like me, in the light bulbs, we undervalue the discipline of faithfulness. In our culture, in our society, we undervalue faithfulness. That's why you've heard it before. Divorce is so big because you don't have to be faithful, right? You don't have to be faithful with your finances. I think of Michael Scott, right? Anybody like The Office? And he stands in the office. He's like, I declare bankruptcy. And they're like, that's not how that works. Because we think I don't need to be faithful with my finances. I can just pick an easy way out. I don't need to be faithful in my marriage. I don't need to be faithful in my parenting. I can it can become someone else's problem, right? We can just take them here, and this person will fix them. Or this law or this rule or whatever it'll be, or I can just go find something else. And I think we become a culture where we don't value commitment. I think even in the church context, one of the struggles we've had as Anchor, and a lot of people coming from a lot of different backgrounds, is and we've had conversations recently, is about the idea of membership. Because even as I say church membership, there's a lot of emotions that come up with people. Because you've had a bad experience, or you've experienced it being abused. And so when we talk about being faithful and committed, you're like, can we just come to church? What's membership? And when we don't know the answer. And we're wrestling with it because there's this idea that we wrestle with faithfulness. Faithfulness is an interesting thing, and even more interesting is walking and living a life of faithfulness. A couple weeks ago, we talked about David, right? We talked about Saul, and I'm going to recap it, but we talked about David being chosen as the king because of his faithfulness. When everyone else was attending the party, David was faithful right where he was. It was actually the thing that made him a man after God's own heart, is because he desired to sit wherever God placed him faithfully. If it was changing a light bulb, he was faithful in it. If it was sitting with the sheep, he was faithful in it. If it was sitting on the throne, he was faithful in it. And so we've been going through this timeline of 1 and 2 Samuel. And if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in 1 Samuel 17 this morning. And as you're turning there, I want to recap our story because it is all important to understand the context of what's going on. Saul becomes the people's choice. They elect him to be king. God's like, you shouldn't do this. It's going to end badly. They're going to take all your money and your daughters. And literally, that's what the Bible says. They're going to take all your best stuff, and you're going to hate having a king. And they're like, give us a king, right? Because we want, exactly the opposite of what God tells us most of the time. And so they get the king, and it's great, but then Saul becomes power hungry, and he desires to build his empire, and he starts disobeying God and ignoring God. And so for 30 or 40 years, Saul is king. And he's appointed king, and all of a sudden God is like, this isn't good for my people. And so God lifts his hand off Saul's life, and he tells Samuel, I want you to go and find a new king, but it is not going to be the people's choice. It's going to be my choice. And so he finds young David around 12 years old, sitting in the field with the sheep. This is, you have to understand this, the age of this boy. He's probably, there's some disagreement. He's either 8 to 12 years old at this time when he's anointed. He's a child. It's like us going down to the kids ministry and dragging one of the fifth or sixth graders out and saying, you're the next president of the country. And this is going to be great. And they're like, what do I do? Like, bubble gum for everyone. Like, I don't know, like no more school. And this is a child that has been sitting in the field and he's anointed the king. I'm not going to preach the whole sermon. You can go back and listen to it. But David becomes anointed and all of his other brothers are passed over. His father actually forgets about him. And this child is anointed the next king. And as we get to 1 Samuel 17, it's about 5 years later, so he's between 10 and 15 years old when this story happens this morning. Still an awkward middle schooler. He probably had bad BO because he hadn't figured out deodorant yet. Middle schoolers, take a lesson. Go get you some deodorant. You smell funny. And some of you adults, you smell funny, but we're not going there. And so he's 15 years old. And I love where this starts off. If you have your Bibles, I love where this whole passage starts off. This is the very next chapter. And this is important to understand when you read your Bibles as a side note, is that between two chapters, there's a 5-year period. Sometimes we read it like constantly, but if you don't understand the context of what is going on, you don't fully see what's happening. And so in 1 Samuel 17, we find David sitting in the field still. And that is an important thing because it shows you the heart of David. This child is anointed king. And you would think he's going straight to the palace, right? Like they got to protect him. They got to cater. He's the new king of Israel. He's getting risen up. Like if you had the future president, right, you would bubble, like this is going to be the savior of our country. We would like put him in a like bubble boy outfit, right? Like we're not going to make sure nothing happens to you. And where does David go immediately after his anointing? Right back to the field. He goes back to the very place he was before. There's bears and lions and all of these things. They send him right back because he was not ready. See, a lot of times we hear a promise from God. We think God has told me this thing, or God's given me this vision, or he's given me this promise. And we think it's immediate, right? Like God needs to give it to me now. But sometimes you need to go back and sit in the field for 5 more years before there's any movement. And that's a word for someone today, because some of y'all are like me and you're impatient and you're like, I need it now. And so you jump around jobs, or you quit things, or you burn through people because you just want to get to where you have been told you're going. And God is saying, just go back and be faithful where I have you. Sit in the field. And so when we get to 1 Samuel 17, it says David is in the field. In 1 Samuel 17, verse 14, it says David was the youngest son. David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army. So Saul is still king. They're fighting the Philistines, which was a monstrous army, a power. In all reality, they should have crushed Israel. And the oldest brothers are with Saul. But verse 15, David went back and forth so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. David is a grunt. David is the guy like bringing food and taking care of this. He's just running all over the place, not doing anything you would think a king or a future king would be doing. And so we get to 1 Samuel 17, chapter 4, or 17, verse 4, and it says he's going back and forth between the armies. And if you have your Bibles, we're going to start at verse 15. It says, David went back and forth so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. One day, Jesse said to David, take this basket of roast grain and take 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers. Give these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. See how your brothers are getting along and bring back a report on how they're doing. David does not have a fun job. This is not glamorous. This isn't awesome. But it says he does it. Verse 19, David's brothers were with Saul in the Israelite army in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts, as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. They're hyped up. They're like, we're going to win. Woo! Like, they're more hyped than you guys are this morning. Y'all got to wake up. And they're going into battle. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, the army against army. That's how they fought back then. There weren't drones or missiles. You just went hand to hand. It's my kind of fighting, right? Lauren was like, we were talking. She was like, what era would you go back to? I'd be like, knights. Like, I'm a big dude. Like, that's my era. If you are small, that is not your era. You're like, give me drones. I'm like, give me like one of those swinging balls with spikes on them, right? Like, I'm just going hard. And so they're standing and they're shouting at each other. Verse 24, as soon as the Israelite army saw the champion, they began to run away in fright. Have you seen the giant, the men asked. He comes out every day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give the man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempt from paying taxes. Come on now, not bad, right? Yeah, it's like being an Olympian, like you're exempt. And I think that's still true, right? They don't pay taxes if you win a gold medal. That's what I thought. I heard that once. We're going to imagine it's true. Verse 26, David asked the soldiers standing nearby, what will a man get for killing the Philistine and ending this defiance of Israel? Who is the pagan Philistine anyway that he allows to defy the armies of the living God? And these men gave David the same reply. Yes, this is the reward for killing him. And I want you to catch what happens here. David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, and he was angry. This is important. We read over and we get right to David and Goliath, but you have to get the context because David is being faithful. He's doing what God calls him, and he gets sent to the battle, and he's asking the questions as everyone else is running in fear. David is saying, this man is defying God. What do we need to do to defeat him? He's walking in God's promise and favor. And the oldest brother rises up and gets angry at him. Church, when you're learning to live faithful, when you're learning to walk in faith and trust God, don't let the voice of discouragement send you back to the field when God is calling you into your destiny. It says, if you go on in the passage, it says Eliab rises up and he becomes angry. And he says, what are you doing around here anyway? He says, you're a child. What are you doing around here? Get out of here. What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know your pride and deceit. Eliab is publicly shaming his brother in front of everybody. You just want to see the battle. He rises up and he comes after his brother and he stands in his way. And I wonder how often we're moving in a direction as people, even now. Maybe you're not facing an army or a giant, but maybe you are trying to conquer things and become faithful in your life. And I wonder how often we are moving to where the Lord is leading us, living in a posture of obedience, and the voices begin to rise up. And it derails us from where the Lord's calling us. We underplay the voice of discouragement in our head. That's why we're living in a world crippled by anxiety, because we don't know how to be faithful, and we just listen to all the wrong voices, and we struggle with them, and we're like, what is happening? And we have this older brother rising up in our mind saying, what are you even doing here anyway? You shouldn't go into ministry. You shouldn't get your finances right. You're a horrible mom, or you're a horrible dad, and you don't need to go to college. Like, you don't just, and it begins to derail you from where the Lord has been calling you. Carlos's dad, who's been helping us around here, how many of y'all were grateful for Carlos a few weeks ago when he came and led worship? And John was grateful. He got to go golf. Yeah, someone's excited. And but Carlos's dad has been a mentor of mine since back in those light bulb days. Carlos was in my youth group at that church. He was a middle schooler. And he used to get frustrated with me because I drive the church van too fast. And so he went to the pastor to try to get me fired for it. And the pastor said, why don't you hang around with him and teach him some things? And I'm 37 years old now, and he's still teaching me things, and he's still following me around, and I'm grateful for it. But one of the things, I remember going through a season where I felt like there were a lot of attacks and discouragement rising up. And I remember Jim sitting with me, and he said, Brent, listen to me. Anytime a bright light starts to show up, there starts to be things that are happening. Bugs are always going to follow. Anytime movement starts happening, you ever been camping and you turn on the lights and all of a sudden it's like whoosh, mosquitoes and moths and everything. Anytime a bright light shows up, bugs are going to follow. Things are going to come out of the woodwork and out of the darkness to try to quench out that light. And this is David in this moment. David is only doing what his physical father had asked him to do. He was being faithful even in taking the food and going back and forth. David's life is marked by faithfulness. And he's listening to the Father's orders, and he's doing what he's supposed to. And all he does is ask a question. And as he's there, he hears Goliath come out and taunt the Philistines and taunt their God. And he begins to ask, why are you running away in fear? Don't you know who you are? And immediately, his brother comes in. Ironically, the same older brother that was first brought before Samuel. The one that everyone said should be king. And even Samuel was like, this is clearly the one, and God said no to. You don't think that wasn't hanging with him in his head? Like, I should be the one anointed king. I'm the one out here fighting, not my 15-year-old brother bringing food to me. And I love David's response, though, from the discouragement. He says, why are you here? You just want to see the battle. David doesn't even rebuttal him. He says, what have I done now? I was only asking a question. You can tell he's a teenager. That's a teenager's response, right? Some of y'all with teenagers, they're like, what have I done? I didn't do anything. It wasn't me. but David is right. He says, what have I done now? I was only asking a question, and this is what I love about verse 30 is what happens, and this is the lesson we can learn from this. When the voice of discouragement rise up, verse 30 says, David immediately walks over to some others. He walks away from the voice. He says, this isn't the voice I need to be listening to right now. It says he walks over and he asks the same thing, and he receives answers. Then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. Church, do you understand? David has a moment in his life where he can walk away from the destiny, the discouragement. He can lean into it. And it says he doesn't even pay it attention. He moves away from it and he leans into other voices. And it brings him to the throne room of King Saul. We can learn something in this moment because so often we sway from one thing to another, and David moves with a posture of faithfulness, and he says, I won't be discouraged. And he goes before the king, and in Samuel 17, verse 32, Saul says this, or David says this, I'm sorry. Don't worry about this Philistine as he goes before the king. He says, I will fight him. Saul replies, again, another voice. Don't be ridiculous. There's no way you can fight the Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy. He's a man of war since he was youth. But David persisted. I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats. Could you imagine standing before the king and they're like, this is real life battle. This isn't a video game. They're like, he's a giant. He's going to crush you. And he's like, but I took care of sheep and goats. Like David should have been laughed out of the room. Like, what, like goats? Like, come on now. He said, when a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after him with a club and I rescue the lamb from his mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and I club it to death. I think David's giving a little bit of theatrics here. Like he's hyping himself up. Like, God, there ain't no one grabbing a bear by the jaw. But maybe David's superhuman, right? Like if there's a bear, I'm like, you can have the sheep. It's yours. Take it. Be merry. Have some lamb chops today. All I picture is Jurassic Park in my head, like the T-Rex getting the goat. And I'm like, take it. I ain't fighting you. But David's like, I'll punch a T-Rex in the face. He's like, I'm getting it. I'm going after it. And he says, I grab it by the jaw and I club it to death. There's some symbolism between David and Jesus right here. You have to catch what's happening. I've done this with both lions and bears, and I'll do this with this pagan Philistine too. For he defies the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion or bear will rescue me from the Philistine. David, again, as the voice of discouragement, he leaves his brother, thinks, I'm going before the king. I'm good now. What's the king do? You can't do this. You will fail. And David doesn't say, well, maybe you're right. He says, no, I'll punch him in the face. Like this is the faith of a child, as the Bible says. Like he doesn't know any limitations. He just knows God. And I wonder what our lives would look like in this modern era, right, where we have everything. If we lived with the faith of David to say, I just know God and I know he'll take care of me. My posture is in his shadow. It says Saul finally agrees to send David to his death, essentially. Saul knew he was anointed to be the next king. Saul's like, go, have fun. I'll keep my throne. Like, you can go and die. Have fun with it. He sends him, and so it says they begin to prepare him for battle, so they put armor on him. If you read in your Bibles, it says they put armor on him, and they hand him a sword, and literally he's weighted down to the ground. He's like, I cannot fight in this. In 1 Samuel 17:39, he says, I can't go on in these. I'm not used to them. So David took them off, and he picked up 5 smooth stones by the stream and put them into his shepherd bag. Then armored only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to the Philistines. It's what marks David as great. Man says you need a sword and you need armor, but David knew who God created him to be. And so as he laid down the sword and the armor, and he said, God didn't call me to be this. This is who I am. And he had the faith to walk away from the sword and knew God was calling him to the stone, and he put it in his bag. Church, I want you to catch this. Most of us in our lives don't even have the faith to even pick up the stones. Most of us in our lives don't even have the faith to pick up the stones. David not only was willing to move, he was willing to go. But the great act of faith, I've preached this story. I've heard this story. We always talk about David slaying the giant. And he does. Spoiler alert, kills the giant, chops his head off, right? We're not even going to read it. The great act of faith wasn't the fact that he killed the giant. The great act of faith is that he bent down and put the stones in his shepherd's bag when everything else said to grab the sword. When every voice said to run, he was faithful. Most of us wouldn't even get to that place where we kneel down next to the stream because the voices would have kept us from the will of God far earlier. If we're being honest. And I look at my own life and I think, man, how often have I ran from where God was calling me because something from my past came up? Or someone was angry about something, or something rose up that kept me from moving in a certain direction. Man, how often have I missed the moment? Or maybe I still had the moment, but I had to walk through some things to get there, that if I just would have had the faith to bend down and grab the stones, I would have seen God's glory. See, David isn't just willing to face the giant in front of him, to conquer him. He has the faith to move forward when everyone else says to stop. Again, it's what marks him to be a great king. It's why even now David is considered the greatest king of Israel. He had his failures, and we'll get there. He messed up. He wasn't perfect, but he always knew, even in his failure, how to sit in the shadow of God. And when everyone else was discouraging him, when everyone else had every reason for him not to rise to the occasion, he knelt down and picked up the stones. I've been reading a book by Erwin McManus called The Genius of Jesus, and I might actually do a book club on it here at the church with some people if they're interested, because it's a phenomenal book. And in the book, he's talking about how God has birthed genius in all of us. And actually, there's been studies when kids are babies, everybody is born with the capacity to be a genius. And only as we get discouraged and voices rise up, we begin to lose some of that genius as we grow older. There's people who actually did smarter than me that I don't even understand the science that said every baby is born a genius. We actually learn to not be genius as we get older. We actually learn to be discouraged because, and his angle that he talks about is that we're birthed in the identity of God. We're made in his image. And so when he births, when we are created, the thumbprint of God is on us. And so we carry that genius with us. And in the book, he was talking about Albert Einstein. And I've seen the crazy pictures. I know about him making math equations and doing, again, smarter things than I understand. But what I didn't know about Albert Einstein is that he never even spoke a word until he was 3 years old. People actually thought he was like brain dead or something, mentally handicapped. And he never said a word until he was 3 years old. This guy that the world would acknowledge now was a genius. Smarter than ever, all of us combined in this room, I would imagine. Maybe one of y'all are smarter than Albert Einstein. What are you doing here? You should be at like Harvard or something. But he didn't speak until the age of 3. And actually, he was not only dyslexic, and if you don't know what dyslexia is, you read everything backwards, you scramble up letters in your head and sometimes numbers and things. This mathematician was dyslexic, but he was also autistic his whole entire life. And it said he grew up with everybody saying, like, you can't do it, you're too dumb, you're not smart enough. And he grew up in this context with all of these negative voices. But what made Albert Einstein a genius in our world's regards is that he pushed through the voice of discouragement. He chose to ignore it. And he leaned into who God created him to be. Whether he acknowledged it or not, who God had created him to be. And actually, we have this guy who was dyslexic and autistic and couldn't even speak until 3 years old. He was the one who discovered singularity. And if you don't know what singularity, it's the science that proves that the universe was created from a single point. It's the science that proves God in creation, essentially. That there was a point that the earth, that the universe exploded into existence, and it has been constantly expanding ever since. What would have happened if someone like Albert Einstein would have leaned into the negative voices? Would have walked away from being faithful? If he wouldn't have unlocked his genius, what would it have robbed the world? The contributions he's made, the things that we have now that are results, technology that's a result of him leaning into his genius rather than to discouragement. Church, this is why I bring up Einstein, because Einstein had the same thing David had. David had the ability to push through the voices. And in that moment when he said, I'm not going to listen to my brother, he had his brother tell him to go. He had the king tell him to go. And then he had the armor thrown on him. And as he sat, he could have just sat and said, 3 strikes and I'm out. All of these things are against me. This is stupid. I can't even lift a sword. And I'm facing a giant with chainmail that weighs 125 pounds. I will be crushed and defeated. I'm going to be a joke. I'm going to be written in his history as the dumb boy that tried to face a giant and got destroyed. That would have been the thought in most of our heads. Instead, the Bible says he lays it down and he says, this is not who I was made to be. And he picked up the stones. He knew who his identity was in God. He knew who God called him to be. Church, we need to learn to be faithful. In whatever season you're in whatever you're facing, if God has called you there, he will see you through. And it might take 5 years. You might go back to the field. But David, never once does it say David became unfaithful in his call. He said, okay, God, if this is where you have me, I will do it. If I'm to deliver food, I will do it. If I'm to just sit with the sheep, I will do it. And when the time rises up for me to face the giant and to acknowledge you, I will do it. Even when everything says to run. When literally the army abandons him and he's standing in the valley with the giant, it says he flings a stone at his head. The giant falls. And David picks up his massive sword and chops the head off the giant. And he says, look what God has done. It's what made David great. It wasn't look what I've done. Look how strong and mighty I am. Look what the Lord has done. David knew how to be faithful. So I wonder this morning, whatever you're facing, or I would imagine most of us right now are facing a voice of discouragement in our lives. With the amount of voices around us and the things that are happening to us, what voice are you listening to that you need to walk away from and lean into the call of God this morning? What would you be robbing the kingdom of God from, this world from, by not walking in faithfulness to where he's calling you? Where do you need to be faithful this morning? In the season God has put you in. What do you need to walk away from? What do you need to quit listening to? What do you need to say, God, if this is what you would have for me, whether it's a field or a throne or slaying a giant, I'm faithful in it. So that we can unlock, whether you call it genius or call or the will of God, whatever you want to call it, so that we can unlock what God has called us to be. Because we have one mandate, to go into the earth to make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. It starts with your faithfulness, right where you're at. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, God, I thank you for your word. God, I thank you that you put things within us that even when we ignore, God, are still there. Even when we abandon, it's still there. And God, you are faithful to us. God, that you pursue us. God, that we see through Jesus, that through all lengths, you will pursue your children and chase after them so they will know you. Even when we abandon and we reject, God, you still chase after us. And through the cross, we see your great love. And even after the cross, that your son was resurrected just so we would know your goodness, your faithfulness. God, I pray that we would be a church, we would be a people that would learn to be faithful, that would lean into the faithfulness that you have called us to, that we would be faithful in our season and our position where we are, but God, we would hear you when you call. God, we would reject the negative voices or the discouragement, and we would lean into your promises. And so this morning, God, I pray that if anyone's battling discouragement, God, your spirit would fall on this place. They'd begin to hear your promises. They'd begin to hear your faithfulness. They'd begin to hear who you called them to be. And God, they would begin to unlock the genius within them. God, the Spirit of God that you have placed within them, the call within them to walk in faithfulness this morning. Not for our glory, but for yours. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. You guys can stand and sing as we go.